All right, so Dr. Fauci, also known as the Science, testified before Congress once again. And what we're going to go through today is kind of all the top talking points, like what actually happened, what was said, what was actually meaningful to all of this. The other thing that we're going to try to do here is we're actually going to do a steel man argument for Fauci. So we're essentially going to say, look, at certain stages of the pandemic, this is what he knew, or maybe he didn't know. This is what he was dealing with. These were the instructions that he gave. This might have been the reasons why. So we're going to do all of that to try to put this on just a good objective playing field so that we're not just sitting here, bashing him, because as anybody that's watched us for a while knows that we're not big fans of the way Fauci handled the pandemic, but we also want to be intellectually honest with all of this. So we're going to attempt to do that. We're going to show you some highlights. We're also going to do some analysis to determine whether or not some of the things that were said during the testimony were actually accurate. In the end, we're going to go ahead and try to come up with some sort of semi-comprehensive conclusion on what this testimony actually achieved and where we should go from here. All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument, brought to you by Good Ranchers. I, of course, am your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio is my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
Then we also have our resident historian and political prognosticator and mostly benevolent warlord, Christian Hines.
At some point, you're going to drop the mostly benevolent part.
Oh no, I think Christian's definitely, as he gets more and more black pilled, it's just going to be like, no more mostly benevolent, just warlord.
Well, let me tell you what was really black pilling. It was watching some of the recent stuff that's come out, over the past just couple days, really.
Yeah. Between
Fauci and some members of Congress talking about handling the pandemic, which is what we're talking about in today's podcast. And I've only seen a couple clips so far, so a lot of what we're going through today, it's kind of like a blind react from me. But the few things that I did see, it was kind of like, wow, it's incredible what he was able to get away with no repercussions or consequences whatsoever.
Well, I think some of the things that we need to do here. So again, laying kind of the groundwork. The purpose of this is to try to go through and analyze what was said, what was meaningful, what might have been more kind of playing to the cameras as opposed to giving people new information. But there were some good points that I think were made. And the reason why this is so important is because obviously this was probably the single biggest, most impactful event for most Americans currently living within their lifetime. I mean, obviously 9/11 was a big event for someone like me. It changed the whole trajectory of my life for about a good 10 years, mine and my family's. But when you talk about the pandemic, it was not only a case of how it impacted people and their businesses and their education and their lives, but it also gave us a glimpse to the amount of power a government can essentially take within a relatively short period of time, and the extent to which people will go to not only hand over their freedoms, but essentially advocate for people to be locked up for non-compliance when people are scared. What's probably even more amazing is how once we were past, I would argue, like the fear stage, because there was an initial fear stage where none of us really knew what exactly this was going to do. We didn't know how bad it was going to be. And I think there needs to be some degree of sympathy for maybe decisions made early on when we didn't know. But it was fascinating how in a relatively short period of time, and by that I mean within about a year, we had a pretty good idea of how COVID functioned, who it primarily affected, various, main lines of transmission, all of that, right? We knew it. And yet you still had people that were advocating for some pretty draconian measures. And I don't mean just some of the stuff that was going on in Australia. I mean, when you polled people and you asked them questions like, what should we do with the unvaccinated? And significant portions of the population were saying things like, imprison them. That gives you a glimpse of how far people are willing to go, not just when they're scared, but just when people have essentially been bifurcated down into two different categories. And it's seen as friend and enemy distinction. And if they're your enemy and you can morally justify, this is a very, very important part that we're going to talk about in this episode, the ability to morally justify the use of violence in order to ensure compliance, right? So let's start off with this. Let's start off with step one of the steel man argument, right? Just instead of sitting here and just trashing Fauci, which, again, I'm gonna admit I'm predisposed to do because I didn't like a lot of the things that he was doing. But we're going to try to be intellectually honest here. So when this was first really hitting the country, and I've got some stats here that I wanted to bring up just to kind of illustrate this point. If you look at what was going on early on, right? And I'm not going to put these on screen. I just kind of want to read them off so people understand. And you were looking at like new deaths per day in the United States. So if you go back and you look at around March 25, March. So we started to see signs of COVID earlier or later in the year in, what was it, 2019?
Like around November, I think people started falling ill and they couldn't, it wasn't the flu. They didn't know what it was. There was no way. And I also remember sometime probably in December, Christian texted me at like 1 a.m. and he's like, this stuff coming out of China is crazy. And he's like, if you look at the satellite imaging, it's like they're burning something. And he's like, I think their death toll's higher than they're claiming it is. And I remember him saying that way back at the time and talking about the Spanish flu, and because he's a history buff. So and he's like, this is weird. And I'm like, it's probably nothing, no big deal. And I shared it even with your mom, and she's like, it's probably nothing, no big deal. And then all of this unfolded. So again, Christian prognosticator, not just in politics, apparently.
I remember following. I was at my grandparents'. And it was December 2019, and I was exchanging text messages with like Joe and some other people about your upcoming congressional campaign. But there was this like small number of people. It was growing by the day, but it was mostly confined to Twitter and the deepest, darkest corners of the internet, where it wasn't covered in a lot of mainstream outlets, right? Of people that were following what was coming out of this, city in China, out of Wuhan. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, it was like Christmas time, right? It was late December 2019. And I remember thinking to myself, like, yeah, this is strange. Like it is. And I kept thinking about the Spanish flu. And I do remember that conversation that I had with Tina at the time. And then I remember coming back to Virginia because I was in Florida for Christmas. And then I came back to Virginia. We had the big rally in Richmond in January in defense of our gun rights. And then I was having a conversation with my cousin at the local bar here in Culpeper and talking about the same thing. And it was like, that was the last time that I was out in public, right? Because then everything shut down in a very short amount of time.
So I remember being in legislative session when all this was going on, right? We had a brand new Speaker of the House. Things had changed over. The Democrats had completely taken control over Virginia. So there was a lot of stuff going on. But here's what I want to do, just to kind of lay out the case here. So if you looked at the average daily deaths in the United States with respect to COVID going back to, and this comes from usafacts.org, but if you go back to the 7-day average, right? In February of 2022, you had like 0.1 deaths, 0.1 deaths, 2 deaths, 3 deaths. By the time you get up to like April 15th, its 7-day average is 2,100 deaths. That's a pretty big jump in a relatively short period of time. So you got this huge delta, right? Where it just shoots up and all of a sudden there's a lot of deaths and everyone's like, what the hell? Like, what the heck is going on? Now, remember that prior to some of this going on, Trump started to implement travel restrictions, and it was like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer going out. This is blowing out of proportion. Nancy Pelosi was walking down Chinatown in San Francisco going, we're here for the festival. Don't be scared.
Yep.
And the only reason I point that out is because it was amazing to see that early on, it was actually Trump was the one that was saying, hey, look, there's some problems here. We need to shut down some restrictions. But because for Democrats, the friend-enemy distinction was, well, he's just doing that because he's xenophobic and racist, and we're not going to do it. We're not going to believe this. And then all of a sudden, when it was like, okay, the death tolls are shooting up here, then it was, you're not doing enough.
And then that's when Fauci was on the TV telling people, do not wear a mask if you are not a medical professional. It's probably not going to help you anyway. You're going to touch your face. And he was telling people not to wear masks at first.
He was telling to, now, again, this part of the show is the Steele argument for Fauci. The reason why Fauci was saying so, the argument that he gives, right? Uh-huh. People need to understand the argument that he gives was we had limited masks at the time.
Right.
And we didn't want people rushing out and buying N95 masks because relatively early in this, Trump did institute policies where I forget what the name of the actual policy was, but they were ensuring that they could basically drastically increase production in order to get additional resources. So let me see here. I was going to see if I could figure out. The first known American deaths occurred in February on March 6, 2020. So March 6, Trump allocated $8.3 billion to fight the outbreak and declared a national emergency on March 13th. The government also purchased large quantities of medical equipment, invoking the Defense Production Act of 1950 to assist. By mid-April, disaster declarations were made by all states and territories as they had increasing cases. A second wave of infections began in June, following relaxed restrictions in several states, leading to a daily cases surpassing 60,000. By mid-October, a third surge of cases began. There were over 200,000 new daily cases. Now, the reason why, we're pointing this out is because if you're operating in an environment where you have something, you're not quite sure what it is, and then all of a sudden you're starting to see a lot of daily deaths, you're seeing a lot of other issues, and again, let's not forget that people demand answers when you see stuff like this, right? So you see this first surge by April 20th, so late April, that's where you have the first big wave of death tolls, and then it drops, right? It drops into June, and then see another big spike. And so you see another big spike going into the winter, which kind of makes sense, right? For something like COVID, when it gets hotter, not to mention the fact that people are now adjusting their activities accordingly. And so it starts weighing out, and then it shoots up again.
Well,
now,
initially, it was 14 days, flatten the curve. Initially, it wasn't necessarily that they thought they were going to stop the virus. That's another thing that a lot of people, they're like, well, they did this and it didn't stop anything. And it's like the goal was never to stop anything. But it's like after the 14 days to flatten the curve, everyone switched to, we need to not go anywhere so that this virus will stop spreading, right? And that was absolutely never the goal. The goal was to keep cases flowing in at a slower rate so that the medical facilities could accommodate the numbers.
You don't overwhelm resources,
right?
And initially there was a huge push
because everyone was going to catch it anyway.
Yeah, well,
and that's what everybody knew. We're all going to catch this anyway. And we're just trying to slow it down.
Yeah, that was the important thing. Now, the height of this, and this is going to come into, conversation later. The height of this is right around when we're talking about 7-day average deaths, is in January of 2021. That's where you had 3,500 deaths as a 7-day average, right? So that's significant, right? That's significant. We're not trying to claim it isn't. It's also the height of flu season. It's the height where a COVID-style virus would be the most, damaging. And then you see a massive drop off, where you get back down to April of 2021, it's down to 670 deaths. Then you see another spike in September of 2021, where it goes back up to 2,000. Then it drops, then it jumps up again in January to 2,600 range, and then it drops again. And now it never really goes above maybe 400. That was 2023 had the last time where it was 461 deaths over a 7-day average. Now, again, keep in mind, we were also learning that the people that were most affected by this were people with either comorbidities, so they had something that would, make them more inclined to or more likely to die as a result of this sort of virus. The other thing is it was impacting elderly people far more than it was younger people. Now, that's not to say that younger people didn't die. It's not to say that they weren't adversely affected. You get that with the flu as well. But there was no way that you could look at the data and look at the numbers and come to the conclusion that this represented a significant risk to younger people. Now, younger people coming into contact with older people or people with comorbidities, sure, that could potentially, cause a real problem. But the other thing that needed to be understood about all of this is the way, we have a good friend of ours who's an epidemiologist, and she works on combating things like pandemics. And one of the things she said is, she goes, when people say a virus is going to virus, that's not just flippant, it's the truth. Like, when you have something like this, it's only a matter of time before it gets to anybody. And the question is what's the best way to, first of all, tamp down hospitals getting overwhelmed, so you have people just, in the streets. And then over time, what happens is, as it mutates and whatnot, it usually becomes more contagious, but it becomes less lethal.
Right.
And then people develop natural antibodies and things of that nature. Vaccines are sometimes developed. Obviously, a vaccine was developed very quickly on this one. So all of that to
give you an idea, that epidemiologist did not get the vaccine. That tells you how excited she was about it. And she works on vaccines. She worked on Ebola.
Well, she worked on the Ebola virus.
Right.
So let's. I don't want to confuse what we're doing here with.
I'm just
viruses and vaccinations
exactly.
and things like that. We've also had Dr. Malone on this program to talk specifically about the sort of vaccine that this was. So, all right, steelman argument. bad situation. We weren't exactly sure what was going on. We weren't exactly sure how, what happened in Wuhan. We weren't sure with the lab. Lot of fear out there. People wanted answers. This is another thing that I think people need to go back and look at, right? Because there's criticisms not only of Fauci, there's also criticisms of Trump. There's criticisms of governors. Why did they do X? Why did they do Z? I will tell you right now, when the electorate is terrified, and there was a lot of news going around that was making people believe that everybody was susceptible and this had a high death rate and we could be looking at, just tens of millions of deaths, people demanded answers from the government. And people became very, very comfortable with fairly draconian measures. The real question, I think, as we go into some of this is, what did the government, what did Fauci know at various times, and what did he implement and why? Was there justification for what they did? Right? Was there justification for what some of these governors were doing? Because again, we live in a federated republic. So it's not as if Trump was mandating lockdowns across the country. States had a lot of leverage with respect to how long, how intrusive those lockdowns were. But this is the best argument I could give for, okay, let's be intellectually honest. A lot of people were scared. They were demanding the government do things. We weren't sure how bad it was going to be, right? Now, let's go into discussing the testimony, because and the reason why I think this is so important is because intellectual honesty and consistency is necessary. And if we're going to be intellectually honest, then we have to come to the conclusion that one of the most important things that all of us can do at this particular time is order meat from Good Ranchers. Because if we got Father's Day coming up, that's the bottom line. We have Father's Day coming up, and I have recently discovered there was this one comedian that pointed out that Arbor Day is celebrated more than Father's Day. And look, I love trees as much as the next person, but dad, come on, we're not going to treat dads with the respect that they deserve. And Good Ranchers has a remedy for this. So if you're wondering, what do you get, Dad? Good Ranchers has the King Cut box, right? This is a one-time purchase just for Father's Day. I'm going to tell you what's in this thing. It comes with 2 thick-cut bone-in ribeyes, 4 center-cut filet mignons, 2 thick-cut bone-in New York strips. That's awesome. That's what I want for Father's Day. And I'm very thankful because I do have the King box. My children will be submitting this as tribute for Father's Day, and I have accepted their tribute and will continue to feed them and let them live in the house. So as you can see, it works. It works. Dads love it. Also, if you get a subscription right now, which means you go to goodranchers.com, use promo code Nick, and you sign up for one of the subscriptions, guess what you get? You get free bacon for life, people. Free bacon for life. That means with the subscription you order, they're going to throw on free bacon with every order. It's coming. You could get these. You could get the subscription. You could get the meat, and then you can wrap it in bacon. Just because Good Ranchers loves you, and Good Ranchers wants to say thank you to Father. So go to goodranchers.com, use promo code Nick, get that, and your shopping for Father's Day is over. You're welcome. On behalf of Good. Okay, let's move into the testimony. So here's how we decided to do this. We wanted to keep this flowing along pretty quickly. So we've got a bunch of clips from the testimony because we weren't going to sit here and watch 3 hours of congressional testimony, right? That is a cure for insomnia, not a good show. So we got a bunch of clips here. We're going to watch these. We're going to discuss each one of them. We're going to try to move through these and keep the tempo going pretty quickly. But we want to make sure that we're kind of getting the meat of everything. So let's go ahead and
no pun intended. Get the meat of everything.
Let's go and go through this. The first one here. First clip.
Mr. Fauci, you were quoted on CBS Face the Nation saying it's easy to criticize, but they're really criticizing science. Because I represent science. Do you represent science, Mr. Fauci?
I am a scientist who uses the scientific method to gain information.
Yes, you said you represent science. Do you represent science, Mr. Fauci? Yes or no? Yes or no?
No, that's not a yes or no answer.
Yes, it's a yes or no.
I don't think it is.
Okay, well, we'll take that as you don't know what you represent.
But
this, as director of the NIH, you did sign off on these so-called scientific experiments. And as a dog lover, I want to tell you this is disgusting and evil, what you signed off on, and these experiments that happened to beagles paid for by the American taxpayer. And I want you to know Americans don't pay their taxes for animals to be tortured like this.
Pause right here. So here's the deal. You've got to hand it to MTG, man. She knows. She will go She will go after you in committee. And look, I sit on various committees. I've chaired various subcommittees. And in Virginia, we always try to make sure that we follow a certain degree of decorum and whatnot. But a lot of times when you get a witness that is just simply not willing to answer your question, that's your opportunity to make an impact by actually showing people what's going on. And so, look, I don't always agree with MTG or the way that she does stuff, but
methods.
But I respect the fact that she's willing to go after you when she doesn't think you're being honest with her. And there was a lot of people, let's face it, there's a lot of Americans that are very, very frustrated with this idea that Dr. Fauci in an interview said, well, it's easy to attack me because they don't want to attack science, so they attack me, but I represent science. And it's like, whoa, wait a second. This is an important distinction that we need to make. Like, I clearly have no problem with the scientific method. And I remember a reporter coming up to me because I was running for Congress in 2020, and a reporter coming up to me talking about masks, talking about other things. And he goes like, well, don't you think we should follow the science? And I looked at the reporter. I said, what is science to you? What is science? He goes, well, you know, no. What is science? And he couldn't really give me an answer. He said, science is an analytical process, right? You form a hypothesis, you conduct experiments, you record your results, you conduct follow-up experiments, you publish conclusions. I mean, that wasn't a perfect representation of the scientific method, but it's this idea that this is a process that you follow in order to come to reasonable and rational results about how the physical world works. And yet what we're being told now is that these experts are going to be the ones to tell us what science has concluded. No, they can certainly offer their opinions. They can conduct research. They can tell us what their findings are. They can tell us why they believe these findings justify these policy positions. But one of the biggest problems that we had throughout this entire discussion was this idea that, well, I'm a scientist. Okay, first of all, you're a particular type of scientist, right? You're a medical professional. I will give you credit for being all of those things. I'm not going to take that away from you. However, that doesn't necessarily make you a public policy expert. It doesn't make you an economist. It doesn't make you a transportation expert. It doesn't make you an expert with respect to sociology. And the reason why all of that's important is because if you're in a pandemic and you've decided the most important thing, China did this, the most important thing is 0 cases. That's what we're shooting for, 0 cases. Like, okay, what do you have to do to achieve that? Well, we have to shut down and conduct complete isolation. Okay, well, what are the consequences of that policy? Well, we found out what the consequences of that policy was. It was things like drastic increase in suicide rates, drastic increases in alcoholism and substance abuse, massive economic upheaval, people losing their livelihoods, which again fostered greater substance abuse and suicide rates. Learning loss, significant learning loss. Now, again, it's easy to sit there on your moral high horse and say, well, the science says that. No. You've come up to certain conclusions based off of certain limited studies that were done that told you this about a particular thing, right? About a particular virus. But it's not as if you conducted thorough scientific research about what all of your policies and measures in order to combat this thing would do to the population in general. And so therefore, we weren't allowed to discuss trade-offs in a lot of these things. We were just told that if you're not on board with what Dr. Fauci, right, the expert on virology is saying, right, well, then you're a bad person that wants people to die. And if you're pointing out that, well, wait a second, shutting down the economy and people losing their businesses, and not only that, but arbitrarily shutting down the economy where you can still visit the ABC store and pick up your alcohol, but you can't go to church, right? That's problematic. No, you're just criticizing the science. It is an incredibly unscientific way to approach things.
Well, it is the tactic, though, that is always used toward anyone who's skeptical. So if you're skeptical of somebody's claims and you're skeptical of how this was all, conducted and what they're going to do as a result, you're skeptical about that. You're just a science denier. And him saying he represents science and that's what they really have a problem with. No, actually, we had a problem with corruption in science, and it was starting to really look like something's going on, something's being covered up, and their story was changing from one time to the next, and then no one was allowed to have any dissent. They would use social media platforms and everything else to shut you down if you dissented at all.
Well, we're gonna get to some of that. Let's go ahead and kick on the next clip here.
Real quick, I have a question for both of you talking about steel manning here. I'm not saying that I agree with this argument, right? But what would you say to the response being, A, the reason that they've changed so much stuff is because the virus itself evolved over time. You brought this up earlier. That's the nature of how viruses operate. And so the reason that they're, that individuals like Fauci would say one thing and then 6 months later might say something else is because the nature of the crisis itself evolved over time. And B, we've talked about how you and I, like when the cameras aren't rolling, have talked about how nobody makes a decision with all of the information that could ever exist on any topic. Nobody's omnipotent, right? We all make decisions with a combination of whatever information we have available, plus, heuristics, trade-offs, our interests in certain things.
Sure.
There's always a degree of ignorance for everybody on any sort of decision that they make. Now, the best defense that I think I could muster in support of somebody like Fauci, not that I actually want to support him, right? Yeah. But the best defense that I could muster is that, look, the average American is not a scientist, and I understand that science is a very broad concept. There's 3 branches of science, right? And he's only within one particular branch. But not every American is an expert on virology.
Nor do they have the resources or whatnot to conduct comprehensive studies and or even to even understand some of the comprehensive studies that have been conducted, because some of them are incredibly technical.
And not every American has the time or resources to conduct a bunch of peer-reviewed tests and everything like that. So the reason that I am saying things in a very simplistic manner, or I might say things like, well, I represent the science, is because I'm trying to get across important concepts using very few number of words and explanations to a general public that the vast majority of the public simply don't have the expertise and knowledge in this field through no fault of their own.
Sure. Well, here's the problem with it, though. The problem is the arrogance of the statement. I represent science. It's like, no, what you hope to represent a rational and scientific approach to the problems you're trying to solve and the questions you're trying to answer. But this idea that you represent the science means is, okay, what about everybody else conducting science? What about everybody else that's conducting? What about the people that happen to disagree with you about it? Now they're just disagreeing with science, right? It was an incredibly irresponsible thing for someone of his stature and experience and education to say on national television. And one of the things I have a problem with it is that typically when you find a situation where people are scared, a lot of times they are looking for someone to provide a sense of security and assurance that things are going to be okay, that we're moving in the right directions, et cetera. And the question is always, how do you balance wanting to provide a certain sense of security while at the same time being honest with people about what's going on and not being so arrogant as to assume that you represent the consensus? Because even the consensus is somewhat problematic. Right? There's been a lot of scientific positions taken in the past that had a great deal of consensus among scientists that ended up being wrong. And so how do you know and that's really dangerous, right? It's really dangerous when you have a bunch of scientists all saying the same thing and it's wrong. So how do you combat that? Well, science has a mechanism for that. It's called freedom of inquiry. And it's called the ability to come back and say, I've seen your results, I've seen your findings, I've seen your conclusions, I disagree, and here's why. But Fauci, I believe, actively worked to suppress that because in his mind, he had the moral authority. He felt like I have the most resources, I have the most experience, I have the most power. I'm the one people are looking toward. And therefore, I have the moral authority and moral requirement to shut down these dissenting voices that I think could cause more damage. That's how I think he morally justified it. But again, at that point, you've now made a decision for everybody else that is not scientific. It is at best sociological.
It's what Thomas Sowell warns about with the whole concept of the vision of the anointed.
Yes. It's this, I am in a special place and therefore I must. And again, Fauci even admitted to this on certain things like with masks because people called him on it. Like you told us early on, you and the Surgeon General told us early on, don't wear masks. They don't do any good. And then all of it was sudden, we all had to wear masks and we had a double mask and we had a triple mask. And then you came back later. It was like, well, okay, initially, the reason why we're telling you to do this now is because initially we had limited resources and we didn't want people taking those resources when we had the people that needed them most. It's like, okay, fine. And I might even be able to sympathize on some level with your reasoning. But what it does show me is you were willing to lie to me about something in order to achieve an end state.
So were you lying then or are you lying now?
Yeah.
And that is the question is, I mean, because he didn't just come out and say, don't wear the masks. These people need the masks in order to do all this medical work, blah, blah, blah. He came with his scientific credentials and said, well, as far as the science goes, like the cells are, this is so small and it's going to pass through. And he basically broke down why masks don't work.
Yeah.
And then
subsequently punish people for basically repeating the things that he had said. And that's again, if you would have come out and you would have said, people, do not buy masks at this point. Like, let's say he honestly believes masks work. I don't think he honestly did. I think he had a different motivation, which we'll get to in a moment. But if he honestly believed that masks were just a super effective in restricting this, then the thing he should have said was, ladies and gentlemen, N95 masks are currently in short supply. We're going to have more coming up soon. The best thing that you can do right now is avoid large areas. Don't get into contact with others because we have to have those masks for the medical professionals that can't avoid this, that have to do it. And look, some people would have listened. Some people wouldn't have, just like they did when he did this other thing, right? So the point is that if you would have been honest that I'm not making this argument based off of the science of how viruses spread. I'm making this argument based off of we have limited resources and those resources must at this stage go to these people who need it far more. That would have been an intellectually honest and consistent argument. I think one that a lot of people would have actually respected. Let's go to the next clip. We got to get through these quicker.
And protected legally, you were going to have schools.
Oh, pause on this one. I'm going to save this one. We're going to jump to the next one. I apologize.
Okay.
This is my fault. I thought I had this further down because I do want to bring this one up. I think the reel that we were just about to play is actually, for me, the biggest thing that came up. This was the biggest smoking gun of the testimony, but I want to get to it a little bit later because some other ones we have to go to first. So let's go to the next one.
As a healthcare, this is a rhetorical question, but why? Why would the government, who's never treated a patient for COVID, you can read all the things you want, but you're not there. You're not seeing patients. You're not watching people die, intubating patients right there with that disease in your face, watching it happen, watching the development of this disease and actually learning from it. But I'm being told by bureaucrats what's right and wrong. And what's funny is everything I was censored on, I was proven to be right. Pretty crazy, isn't it? You said in an interview that you gave as part of an audiobook written by Michael Spector.
This is a member of Congress who's a doctor that was actively treating COVID patients. And again, one of the things that he was so frustrated about, and it's actually a very interesting point, is that when he says the government wasn't treating COVID patients, right? It's not like Dr. Fauci was in hospitals treating COVID patients. That's not his function. He largely operates as an administrator at this point of a government program. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't anybody with the government treating or conducting tests or whatnot. But his frustration point is I was a doctor sitting right there treating people as this was going on. And when I noticed things and I talked about those things, I was censored for it. And it wasn't just him. There was a very famous study as well coming out of, I think it was a couple of virologists out of Stanford and some other institutions that were very, very highly regarded within the community. But the moment they came out and questioned lockdowns, all of a sudden, everyone was talking about like what a bunch of quacks they were. And it shocked them to the point where like they were at risk of losing their jobs. Some people did lose their jobs. Some people got censored as a result. Some people lost contracts and everything else. And that wasn't, I don't think Fauci gets to pretend that he didn't play a role in shutting down any dissent. And again, what made this part of the testimony, I think, very, very, one, unique is because a lot of the other members of Congress that are bringing up points, they might be bringing up good points, but they weren't on the front lines actually treating patients. This guy was. And so the government was actively shutting down people that were actively treating patients if they didn't follow the government line. Now, the argument in reverse would be, well, sure, but he's using anecdotal evidence based off of his individual practice, whereas Dr. Fauci and the NIH and everyone else, they have the benefit of research going on all over the country, right? And it's an interesting argument. The problem is that it shouldn't discount what somebody in the trenches is seeing on a regular basis. Especially as more evidence comes forward that proves that some of the things that they were saying was correct, was accurate. And even if it was, something being anecdotal doesn't mean it's wrong, right? It doesn't mean it's right either.
It might mean that the science missed something. There's a factor they didn't put in there. There's a variable somewhere that they missed, and science is not exact. It's a process, as you said before. And so if you don't account for all of the variables, how are you going to get really quality data?
Yeah.
You know what was really nefarious about this was when the Stanford professor, Jay Bhattacharya, put out, he signed that the Great Barrington Declaration in October 2020, which criticized the lockdowns. And we then found out after Elon purchased Twitter, and then the Twitter files came out with Matt Taibbi and stuff like that going through their records. We then found out that Jay's Twitter account was blacklisted by the moderators over at Twitter under the old regime shortly after he co-authored the Great Barrington Declaration, which again criticized the lockdowns. This was in October 2020. There were already dissenting voices within the medical community. And this guy was not a quack, by the way. He was a Stanford professor of medicine. And he wasn't alone either. There was like dozens of medical professionals that were criticizing the response that Fauci and particularly state governors like our governor, Ralph Northam, or Michigan's governor, Whitmer, like also Gavin Newsom in California and Andrew Cuomo in New York, the list goes on, right? All of these policies that were pushed by both Fauci and politicians, mostly Democrats, although I would point out not exclusively Democrats, it was not as if, oh, well, the consensus was that this was the right approach. No, the manufactured consensus was that this was the right approach, but there were absolutely dissenting voices very, very early on within, the first 9 months of the virus being mainstream in the United States. And the response was not, well, let's have an honest discussion and debate about strengths and weaknesses and what sort of policy proposal gets us to the best type of trade-off, right? No, the response was, we're going to silence you on social media and threaten your job and, turn your Wikipedia article into making you look like that you're some sort of lunatic.
Well, let's look at what the Great Barrington Declaration, like what was the meat of it? So in October of 2020, so we've gone through you had the big spike in March, then you had the other big spike, the other big spike was about to come, right? In October of 2020, doctors Jay Bhattacharya, I'm going to butcher the names, I apologize, Stanford University, Sunetra Gupta, Oxford University, and Martin Kulldorff, Harvard University, authored the Great Barrington Declaration to express our grave concerns over the inadequate protection of the vulnerable and the devastating harms of the lockdown pandemic policy adopted by much of the world. They proposed an alternative strategy. So it's not like they just had critiques. They had an alternative strategy, which focused on the most vulnerable because at this time we had sufficient data to point out that certain people are adversely affected by this and other people, it's bad. It can be lethal, but it tends not to be, like very, very low death rate among people like under the age of 65 with no comorbidities. Because the GBD was signed by more than 50,000 scientists and medical professionals and 800,000 members of the public. So again, you've got three experts, right, in their respective fields that are relevant to this particular thing from Stanford, Oxford, and Harvard, plus 50,000 other scientists and 800,000 members of the public. On October 8th in 2020, the National Institutes of Health Director Francis Collins targeted the GBD, the Great Barrington Declaration, in an email to Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. There needs to be a quick and devastating public takedown of its premises, Collins wrote. I don't see that online yet. Is it underway? Gupta, Bhattacharya, and Kulldorff were all leading experts in infectious diseases, but Collins smeared them as fringe epidemiologists, and the NIH bus got the hit pieces he wanted. Consider, for example, that the Great Barrington Declaration, When Arrogance Leads to Recklessness by Brooks Gump, a psychologist with a master's degree in public health. As his bio explains, Gump's work has been supported by numerous NIH grants. In effect, Gump was on Collins' payroll. This kind of goes in to explain more of what was happening at this point. And this is the frustration here. There's a lot of things that Fauci might have done that apart from things like this, I could have said, I don't agree, but people were scared and maybe he was trying to do the best he could. It's the silencing of any dissent that fosters a real problem for me.
Right. And right around the time that they were silencing dissent and they were working really hard to get that vaccine out like in lightning speed. And it's really interesting to me that is a vaccine method that had not been used in humans yet. And just suddenly they had all the funding in the world to just get it through. And so they just rushed this thing through. Well, right around that time, you had a lot of other things developing as well.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and let's look at the next clip here. And this I think it has to do with death threats toward Fauci.
Can you please share with us the nature of the threats you have received since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, there have been everything from harassments by emails, texts, letters of myself, my wife, my 3 daughters. There have been credible death threats leading to the arrests of 2 individuals, and credible death threats means someone who clearly was on their way to kill me. And it's required my having protective services essentially all the time. It is very troublesome to me. It is much more troublesome because they've involved my wife and my 3 daughters.
Look, this is the part where, look, I have a real problem. I have a real problem with death threats directed against people, and I have even a bigger problem with death threats directed at their families and whatnot. Now, when he says 2 credible death threats that led to the arrest, I also want to just point out that at a degree of an extreme tension, and the fact that a lot of his policies were leading to situations where, again, people were losing everything. They were losing their livelihood. Beloved family members were dying, and they were legally not permitted to
dying
go
alone.
and see them.
They
dying
had to see
alone.
him through glass.
So people were very, very frustrated. And according to Dr. Fauci, that resulted in 2 credible death threats where somebody was trying to do something and both of them were stopped. So I would say anybody that was threatening to kill somebody, I don't think that's appropriate. Obviously, I do think people should be prosecuted for doing things like that. By the same token, I think the object of this part of the testimony was trying to illustrate that Dr. Fauci was bravely trying to do all of these things amidst these massive death threats. And again, two credible death threats.
Yeah, the shocking part to me is that there weren't more. He destroyed so many lives across the nation, destroyed them. And the fact that there were only 2 that were credible enough to have to deal with, that's actually not that high.
There was probably others that needed to be investigated. And again, I think it's horrible, right? Especially when people are I understand sometimes that emotions and passion can get the best of people. I've had death threats. Right. But there's something different when you direct it to people's families. Now, again, I think I actually think this part of the testimony didn't demonstrate what they were hoping it would demonstrate. I think they were hoping to hear that there were tens of thousands of death threats and the FBI was just overwhelmed trying to, get people and prosecute them and everything else. And so again, while I'm sympathetic, even though I don't agree with Dr. Fauci's policies, I'm sympathetic to anybody that faces death threats. I'm actually a little bit shocked that there was only 2 credible ones, especially based off of the way the media treated this, as if anybody that disagreed with what Fauci was doing was just a harebrained idiot that was dangerous. And to that point, I want to point out that there were some polls that were conducted. So I'm gonna reference one here. There was a Rasmussen poll. This was in, this was a while. I'll try to find the date here, but there's a Rasmussen poll that finds that a majority of likely Democratic voters favoring taking strong action against Americans who are not vaccinated against COVID-19, including fines and home confinement. 48% of Democrats also would give the green light to government fines or imprisonment for those who question the efficacy of the vaccine on social media or other public forums. That was 48% of Democrats
just for
polled.
questioning
Just
publicly.
for questioning it. 45% of Democrats gave a thumbs up to forcing the unvaccinated into temporary designated areas. We have another name for that. It's called concentration camps. While 46% support using digital devices to track the unvaccinated to ensure they are quarantined or properly socially distanced from others. A smaller number of Democrats, 29%, would go so far as to temporarily remove parents' custody of their children if the parents refuse to take the vaccine. The poll commissioned by the Heartland Institute was released the same day the U.S. Supreme Court handed the Biden administration a stinging blow in blocking its employer COVID-19 vaccine and testing mandate. The results put Democratic support for the vaccine mandate at 78% compared to sort levels of 22% among Republicans and 41% for unaffiliated voters. But that wasn't it, right? So in case you're saying, well, that's Heartland Institute, right? That's a conservative organization. Rasmussen is known for being more of a conservative pollster. Okay, let's go to this other one. And this other one, it was 1/3 of Americans say they haven't got the COVID-19 shots. Majority of Democrats say they should be confined at all times or fined. A majority of Democrats say they'd support the unvaxxed being confined to their homes at all times, with 45% saying they should be confined to designated facilities and 55% support for fines. Roughly 1/3 of Americans surveyed in a recent poll said they haven't received the COVID-19 shots, and the majority of them said they don't plan on getting them. The unvaccinated would be targeted by a majority of Democrats in another poll who say they favor a government policy that would require them to remain confined to their homes at all times except for emergencies. The polls were conducted in early January. The first poll, conducted by The Economist and YouGov, found that among those surveyed, 69% said they'd received at least one COVID-19 dose, 31% said they'd received none. Roughly 1,500 people were surveyed in a range of issues. Right, so...
And there's a huge number of people, too, that got one dose of one of the vaccines because they were terrified.
Or they were told they'd lose their job.
Well, there is that. But there's also, you remember how they were banging the drum of if you've got asthma, if you've got this, if you've got that, comorbidities, the whole deal. You like get this, it'll save your life, basically.
Yeah.
And so people were just like, okay, as soon as it's available, I'm going to go get it because they were terrified.
Yeah.
And so they used fear a lot. And at the same time that they were terrifying all of these people, they were starting to go, well, you know, everything's still in study. We're going to go ahead and have it be 75 years before the public can go back and look at the studies, the conclusions. 75 years? I don't care who you are. If you aren't questioning that, like I'll be dead by the time they're revealing the data.
Yeah.
That's convenient.
Let's go to the next link here.
You know, there's another poll that came out, and I'd like to show people the results of it because it really drives home what happened over the last few years here.
Yeah.
So this is from Pew Research. It goes from 2018 to 2021 at the height of the pandemic. And it was surveying partisan divides related to government's role in restricting misinformation. And the first poll is the percent of U.S. adults who say that the government should take steps to restrict false info online, even if it limits freedom of info. In 2018, it was almost even between Democrats and Republicans. Only 40% of Democrats and 37% of Republicans said that they supported such a policy. By 2021, Democrats suddenly became the party of censorship.
Yeah, 65%.
65% of them said that the government should take steps to restrict false info online, even if it limits freedom of info. That's the fact that they added that caveat in there, and they still, overwhelming majority, 2/3 of them said yes. Meanwhile, Republican numbers actually dropped from 37% to 28%. The more damning thing, I think, though, is the second question, which was the percent of U.S. adults who said that tech companies should take steps to restrict false info online, even if it limits freedom of info. Republicans fell from 48% to 37% because they saw what happened. Yeah. They were the victims of this. Meanwhile, Democrats went from 60% approval to 76% approval. Basically, all Democrats think that, oh, well, you know, it's the argument that we'll build your own platform.
Yeah.
Right? You know, oh, well, Twitter's a private corporation. They can do whatever they want until Elon buys it. And then suddenly they're going to start raging about how this is very dangerous for our democracy.
Yeah.
These two polls, I think, actually illustrate a big vibe shift that took place over the last few years, but particularly during the pandemic years, where Democrats realized that they became the managerial class that were running the bureaucracies, that were also running many of the private companies or publicly traded companies that were actually the platforms for these things. And they concluded, oh, we control the algorithms and we control the bureaucracy. let's use them to our own ideological benefit.
Yeah.
And then cloak ourselves around how we're the good guys because we're restricting bad misinformation.
Yeah. And
But
the other
why
guys
is it-
want to kill grandma.
Why
Yeah.
is it that every single piece of misinformation is detrimental to their political end state? Now they might argue, well, this is because reality has a liberal bias.
Yeah.
But
well, that's always the case, right? But again, it's also a very unscientific way to approach things, because when you talk about false information, okay, who gets to decide which information is false?
Right.
And again, I have a hard time swallowing that pill from people that believe that men can get pregnant, right? Like they're going to be the censors
Exactly.
of what constitutes, valid information. And I remember seeing this, I think it was in 2015 or 2016. It was either 2015 or no, it was either 2016 or 2017. I was sitting on a committee where we had a Democrat legislator that was bringing forward a bill where he wanted a special class for kids. He wanted a special course for kids in public school that was going to teach them how to spot misinformation and disinformation. And wouldn't you know it, if you looked at all the organizations that are going to be responsible for actually developing what this course looked like, it was all left-leaning organizations. And we pointed out at the time, it's like, this seems a little bit nanny state-ish. No, that's not what this is at all. We just want to teach kids good critical thinking skills. No, you didn't. You have this idea that the information that you want to put out to kids, that you want to put out to people, is good and noble because your intentions are good and noble. And any information which contradicts what you might want to put out there must be bad and misinformation or disinformation because it's not helpful to our end state. And so you don't get to say that as a matter of public policy. You don't get to want to try to implement that through law and then call me the fascist.
Right.
You don't get to do that. All right. Little miss, Mr. Everything within the state, nothing with outside the state. Right. Okay. Let's go to this next
This
clip.
coming from the same people that don't believe in absolute truth are really concerned about truth
Yeah,
online.
like I said, the managerial leftists
Yeah.
that control these corporations and the federal government think, well, reality has a liberal bias, which is so hilarious coming from the people that can't define what a woman is and thinks that transgender surgeries for minors is a good thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, next clip.
We got a few more to go through here.
Suggested to be 10 feet.
I don't recall, Mitch, if it was ever suggested it was 10 feet, but when I made my explanation of what it was, I was saying that there was no trial that looked at 10 versus 6 versus 3 versus not even worrying about it at all.
Okay, pause. So what this
That's
was
social distancing.
Yeah, this is the social distancing and why 6 feet. So the person he called him Mitch, and that's because this is the attorney for the House GOP that is now asking questions to Fauci. I actually thought this part was interesting because it was again, depends on what you're going to watch this testimony for. I really wasn't as interested in kind of some of the theatrical standpoints, not because there isn't value sometimes to that, but because I like the exchange, which I think is easy to follow between, I'm going to ask this question, you provide this answer. I think Fauci gave a little bit more clear answers. In fact, it's kind of where he got in trouble. He got in trouble actually when he was answering questions from the attorney, because, things like 6 feet, like this became like biblical, right? You must maintain 6 feet because that's going to provide additional protection. And then you have Fauci saying, well, there was no study between 10 feet or 6 feet or not doing this. 6 feet.
We didn't test it. We just threw this number at the wall.
And again, it's one thing to say, look, we think it would be better if you stayed further apart. We think 6 feet is reasonable because people still got to go into places and things like that. But if you say 6 feet, we think that's more but no, it was 6 feet. And it was amazing the number of people that looked at it like 6 feet is, that's life or death. Life or death is 6 feet. And anybody that was like, yeah, I know a little bit about how viruses work. I'm not claiming to be an expert, but I can read a couple of articles, and yeah, I'm guessing 6 feet just really ain't gonna do much. I didn't realize you were a scientist. Like, well, I'm not a moron, right? Like,
I have to be honest, I loved the 6 feet social distancing. I was like, yes, because I don't like people inside my bubble anyway, and I tend to be an introvert. So it's like, yeah, I love the fact that you and your cart need to stay 6 feet behind me. I love that. This is great.
So Tina loves 6 feet for public policy, not because it saves you from COVID, but because it just saves her from having to deal with you.
Yeah. And as much as I hated the masks, it was also kind of great that you didn't have to give a courtesy smile to everybody who walked past. They didn't know if you were smiling or not.
I gotta say, it made bank robbing so much easier. All right.
No, what it really made was burning down American cities in the summer of 2020 quite easy.
A lot easier.
Yeah. Well, it turns out COVID actually doesn't affect large scale protests, provided that those protests are conducted in the pursuit of liberal policy.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Like I had no idea that COVID was that partisan, but apparently
you want to talk about a real black pill moment? It was when letters were being published, circulated within the scientific community, where you had hundreds of scientists signing onto letters saying, we support the protests.
Yes.
Go out there and protest for BLM or George Floyd or any of the other social justice stuff. And at that point, that's when I realized, oh, this is it's all a sham.
Yeah.
It's not that the pandemic was a sham, but it's that the response to it is a total sham. It's all ideologically hijacked.
Yeah, because those were the same people 2 months earlier, or maybe it was 1 month earlier. I guess it was probably one. Looking at everybody that went down to spring break and they were partying and doing all this stuff. And they're like, how dare they? How dare they go down there and endanger people's lives? They're all going to die and that'll be their fault. And it was just like that. And then 1 month later or so, give or take a few weeks, here they are, burning down cities and blocking ambulances from getting where they need to go.
Well, here was the part too where they said that racism was its own pandemic, right? And that racism was such a public health threat, and that racism was such a threat to just society in general, that the protests were warranted, which is interesting because what they were just admitting in that thing is we do believe in trade-offs. We do believe in trade-offs. And the trade-off is if you're protesting in something that we believe helps us concentrate political power, or let's be generous, if you're protesting something that we believe ideologically is incredibly important in the manner in which you're doing it and how you're doing it, then it's okay. Then all of these other things that we told you have to restrict you from going to church, restrict you from running your business, restrict you from engaging in commerce, restrict you from seeing grandma before she dies, right? All those things that were so important that we had to prevent you from doing any of those things, that all goes out the window as long as you're protesting in favor of something that we support. Mm-hmm. And again, that's where a lot of people said, you no longer get to look at me and say, you're the party of science. You no longer get to look at me and say this with a straight face. And yet they did, right? And yet they insisted upon it. No, even now, if you don't agree with us, you're anti-science. And what I need people to understand who might be listening to this that maybe don't agree with us on everything, which is fine. When you have that kind of breakdown in intellectual honesty and consistency, it doesn't just go away. People remember it for the next thing that you say. And the next thing you say might be valid, right? The next thing that you say might be scientifically rigorous. But it doesn't matter. When you break trust on that kind of level, people remember it. And that's what's going on.
And it was just like a piling up of all these things.
Yeah.
It just was more and more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And we were all looking at it going, I don't know what I can trust now.
You can't see grandma before they die, but Governor Gavin Newsom can go to the French Laundry fancy restaurant with a bunch of people.
With 50 of his closest friends and donors.
Because he's part of the ruling elite, and it's just different for them, right? It's just different from them. All right, let's go to the next. We got about 5 more here. Let's try to get through these because we got our third.
Do you agree that there was a push to downplay the lab leak theory?
Not on my part.
Really?
Really?
Wow. I think most of the country would find that amazing. I still got 11 seconds.
But look at the facts. I've kept an open mind throughout the entire process.
What a load of crap.
Yeah, that's BS.
That was one of the most blatant lines of crap that ever. And you notice how he said, I kept an open mind. It's like, you're right. He didn't come out and say, he didn't necessarily come out and publicly say, there is no way, it is totally impossible that this happened. But he came pretty close, and he advocated censoring anybody that advocated this as a serious way to consider this. He treated like garbage and helped use the full force of government to punish people for doing something. And if you want to actually see a clear demonstration of this, there is a hysterical interview between Jon Stewart and who was hosting the late night show? I forgot his name now. But he's sitting there, and Jon Stewart
Jimmy
goes,
Kimmel?
No, it wasn't
No?
Jimmy Kimmel. Jon Stewart goes through this whole shtick of, oh, I don't know, maybe the Wuhan lab, the coronavirus Wuhan lab had something to do with a massive coronavirus outbreak. Oh, I don't know. There's been an outbreak of chocolatey goodness in Hershey, Pennsylvania. How do you think it happened? Oh, I don't know. A bat flew into the cloaca of a sea turtle, and that. I mean, he's making fun of it. And the host of the show, you could just see there's terrified, like, well, but we're not saying that. We're not saying it was a lab leak, though, John, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're not saying that, right? Why? Because he knows that Jon Stewart saying this on his show could have economic impacts for his show.
They were all terrified to consider anything else. So Fauci is so disingenuous because he made anybody who even questioned the Wuhan thing, questioned it at all, he made them out to be complete wackos.
Yeah.
And if you'll remember, like Christian, in December, before it was even well known, it might have been here at that point, but while we were still watching it overseas, Christian was questioning that already in the Wuhan area. And I'm like, so anybody that thinks this isn't really a thing, and it's so far out of left field, I don't understand it. It stood to reason that it wasn't a bat in a wet market.
Yeah, it was Jon Stewart on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Again,
That's
another
right,
guy
Stephen
that
Colbert.
prides
Not exactly far-right people.
another guy that prides himself on holding the government to account when they're doing silly things. But yeah, this was the thing that just blew my mind, is that it would have been one thing for Fauci to say. If Fauci would have got up there and said, hey, look, I did not think that the lab leak theory at the time, if he would have got up there and said, at the time that this was coming out as the lab leak theory, I didn't think we had sufficient information to suggest that was the cause of it. And so therefore, I did not give a great deal of credence to that. I didn't say it was impossible. I just didn't think the preponderance of evidence suggested that. That would have at least
He knew
been,
better, though.
Okay, I'm steel manning the argument. If he would have said that, I would have said, okay, I don't like your answer. I don't think you're being completely honest here. But I could see how someone would come to that conclusion. But to say, oh, no, I always kept an open mind. I had nothing to do with piss off, dude.
He didn't want the information linking back to Wuhan. He had ties to Wuhan, so that he didn't want to get in trouble.
He was
right?
a supporter of gain of function research, and
Which was illegal.
Here's the real steelman argument. And I can't believe I'm about to make this argument, but he was a supporter of gain of function research.
Yeah.
He knows that 99% of the public did not know what gain of function was until COVID. And even today, I would argue probably more than half the public still doesn't know what gain of function is. His thought process probably, I'm just guessing, and I'm trying to give him as much
go for it. No more
as
caveats.
much leeway
Get
as
to it.
possible.
Yeah, just
his
do it.
thought process was probably that, look, this is an important thing that I support.
Yeah.
And if the general public ever learns or concludes, rightly or wrongly, that this came from a lab, they will oppose gain of function research, which I think is a good thing. And this thing will go away as a political consequence of the public coming to this type of conclusion. Therefore, I need to disincentivize anybody in the public from drawing this conclusion, because I know the political consequences that will stem from that conclusion are something which I think are actually bad.
But there was another factor.
Wait a second. I need to talk about this, because for those of you who don't really understand what gain of function research is, what it is you take something that's naturally occurring within nature, right? That's a little bit redundant, but and what you do is you modify it, right? You scientifically modify it in order to maybe make it more potent, or to have it transfer from elements within the animal kingdom that it doesn't currently transfer to, like maybe from birds to people, etc. You do it for weapons purposes. Now, a lot of people will look at that, and this is something where Rand Paul has been very adamant about this, is like, we should not be doing this. Here's what I will tell you. The argument on the other side, and I do believe that there's actually a legitimate argument here. The argument on the other side is your enemies are doing this. Your enemies are conducting gain of function research for the purpose of weaponizing certain things to be used against you. The reason why you conduct gain of function research is so that you can then establish things like countermeasures, vaccines. You can understand how it operates, how it spreads, so that if that weapon is ever used against you, you have the appropriate countermeasures in order to mitigate its effects. That is not a bad argument. Let me tell you what is a horrible argument. Gain of function research is really important. I know. Let's fund a lab in communist China in order to do this research. That is borderline insanity.
Well, it's also illegal. So the part you're not bringing up is the fact that it was illegal to use U.S. dollars to do gain of function research, and the U.S. was funding Wuhan.
Well,
and so if they found out that there was gain of function research happening at Wuhan, with basically misappropriating funds, that would also have a massive impact. And I'm sure he was considering it.
No, this is part of the problem that you saw with the exchange between Rand Paul and Fauci, because Fauci was telling Rand Paul he didn't know what he was talking about, and he was a moron, and he was lying to the American public, and we didn't do any gain of function research. We didn't fund gain of function research. And part of that had to do with playing fast and loose with the definitions of gain of function research.
Yeah, he went into the website, or they went into the website and changed the definition on the fly.
And that was also part of the problem that we saw this stuff is when you start going back and changing things, so you can say, what are you talking about? It doesn't meet this definition. Well, how do you know? We had all of these experts say that it doesn't meet that definition. Oh, that's convenient. And last year, would they have come to that same conclusion if you had described what was actually going on? Well, probably not. But the consequences for them not agreeing with us are so much higher now.
Right.
And
Isn't
that's
the
part,
dystopia that we're increasingly lurching towards just phenomenal? Orwell was really onto something when he talked about how we've always been at war with East Asia. I mean, that's actually like a main portion of the plot of 1984, where it's like the government will retroactively rewrite history in order to make whatever the current state of affairs is. Oh, well, it was always this case. And you're just, who are you going to believe? Your lying eyes or us?
Yeah.
And Orwell obviously takes that to a extreme conclusion, but to some degree that the whole Oceania style rewriting of history is actively happening when you have, again, what's so dangerous about this is that left-wing ideologues have captured so many institutions, and particularly the managerial class within institutions. They are the bureaucracy, not just within the federal government, within private institutions, within corporations. And what they end up doing is that they will inevitably wield that power that they have, which sounds like a very boring, power. They're a bunch of, pencil pushers, right? But what they have is the ability to rewrite definitions. They can rewrite history.
Yeah.
They can rewrite what science is.
I mean, that might be for like an ideology, but I maintain that the biggest reason why they did what they did, why he was doing the misinformation, wasn't necessarily to advance communism. I think it was to protect the funding and increase the funding and line the pockets. I think at every single turn, you can see Fauci and his cohorts profiting at every single turn.
I don't think it's that simple. I don't think that Fauci is just some Bond villain guy that wanted to get rich off of a pandemic.
No, not just him, but like the labs he supports, the funding for the processes he supports.
I get it. I think so here's what I think happened on some of the stuff when it comes, and we got some other stuff that we're going to talk to about this specifically where it comes. In fact, I'm going to save it for when we get to the royalties clip, because that's going to play directly into that and what's the possible motivation of this. So let's go to this other one. This is another one, the lab leak theory.
Clarify for the record, because today you testified that you did not suppress the lab leak theory, yet in the past you have said, quote, it is a distortion of reality, unquote. You've said, quote, I've heard these conspiracy theories, and like all conspiracy theories, they're just conspiracy theories. That's what you told the American people. And so would you like to clarify what science were you following then versus now?
Yeah, no, I've also been very, very clear and said multiple times that I don't think the concept of there being a lab leak is inherently a conspiracy.
So again, this is the part that drives Americans nuts, is because at the time, well, I didn't disagree with the concept that theoretically speaking, a lab leak could take place. Okay, no, but what were your actions in the moment? What were your statements and what were your actions? And not just your public actions, but the actions that took place behind the scene to censor and discredit anybody that was coming up with this. Because I watched not only the reaction from the government, I watched the reactions of the people supporting every move the government made and the way they treated everyone from Joe Rogan to accredited scientists in the field. And it was not, well, we're open to the overall concept. No, it was not. It was organized, it was swift, and in many cases, it was career-ending and devastating. So once again, this is why so many people look at what Dr. Fauci is saying right now, like, you have broken all trust. The people that agree with you not for scientific reasons. They agree with you predominantly for ideological reasons. And the people who disagree with you, there is ideological reasons there as well, but it's also because you've lied to us so many times. You could have an ounce of humility, because one thing I will say is that now the right is getting more like this, but we didn't used to be. The right used to be more like, if you own up to it, you fess up and you say, look, this is what I had at the time. This is why I thought it was bad. I probably should have been more open to this concept and this idea, but this is why in this moment in time, I really thought this was a distraction and it was taken away from what was going to be best for the American people. And in hindsight, I would have done this a little bit differently. We would have been mad, but we would have said, guy owned up to it. Now you apologize to the left, not liberals, but you apologize to the left, and they will just go on, okay, and now you need this apology. Now this, it's always a struggle session. But if you want to know why the right is increasingly becoming like, fine, struggle sessions are the order of the day, let's do it. It's this crap. It's doubling down on the, no, what are you talking about? I never had a problem with the inherent.
It's the mass gaslighting.
Yeah.
We both thought the same thing at the same time. It's gaslighting. I'm totally with Dave Rubin on that previous clip. Fauci and people like him need to be held accountable for what they've done. And I think we're going to get to this later.
Let's go to the, we got 3 more clips that we're going to go through, and then we're going to kind of go into our final analysis on this and talk about what should be done in the future. So let's go with those last 3 clips here.
That they should really not be talking about a lab leak.
Thank you.
That's the conspiracy.
Appreciate that. Dr. Fauci, how much have you earned from royalties from pharmaceutical companies since the pandemic began in 2021?
0.
It says NIH scientists made $710 million in royalties from drug makers. You're saying that you did not receive any of the $710 million.
On COVID, I received, I think, $122 for a monoclonal antibody that I made 27 years ago.
Okay, so just in general, though, how much have you received, not related to COVID, just in general, how much have you received in royalties between 2021 and 2023?
I think none.
Okay, so somebody received the $710 million.
Somebody did, but not me.
You didn't receive any royalties. Okay.
I mean, I see no royalties associated with COVID. I mentioned.
I said.
No, I want.
I just said.
I'm on the record, and I want to make sure that this is clear. That I've developed a monoclonal antibody about 25 years ago that's used as a diagnostic that has nothing to do with COVID, and I receive an average of about $120 a year from that patent.
But the bottom line here is that scientists at NIH did receive $710 million in royalties, and I guess my question is, don't you think that if these experiments are made using American tax dollars, that any of those royalties, this nearly billions of dollars, should be going back to the American taxpayer, not in the pockets of the scientists?
Okay, pause. So this is an interesting question on a policy side, right? Because the idea is that if you want to attract the best scientists in the field, they're probably not going to work for whatever NIH is paying. And if you're going to allow them to do complex research that has broad sweeping medical benefits, then chances are royalties is actually let's just be honest, it's a taxpayer efficient way to get scientists working for the government to actually continue to conduct research there instead of just going into the private sector. So the point I want to bring out is when it comes to the royalties, you could make an argument. You could make an argument that this is actually a tax efficient way to get good research by allowing them to be able to get the royalties. The problem comes is from what we just experienced is this idea that, oh, well, I get the NIH, I buy the royalties from the NIH scientists because that's the one that's going to come with government protection, right? And that's where it gets dangerous. That's where you start to look at the corrupt nature of politics. Because let's just think about this for a second. If you're going to have somebody working for a government agency, right, full-time for a government agency, I'm not talking about part-time, I'm not talking about consulting, and you're going to say, we want you to do X, Y, or Z, right? But we're going to allow you a private method to profit off of the work that you're doing for the government. Now, we don't do that for like the military. Like when I was overseas, I was not allowed to use military equipment and resources and operations in order to personally enrich myself at the same time that I was conducting combat operations. Now, it used to be, you look at things like the British Navy, when they would confiscate a ship on the high seas, the captain got a portion of what they confiscated, right? It was one of the ways that you actually funded your military. But the reason why we don't do that now is in large part because it creates a perverse incentive structure. And so I think there's two things here. One is the question of, did Fauci receive any funding, royalties, or whatnot? Or because, look, there's a lot of ways that you could theoretically make money off of this that doesn't include direct royalties. There's consulting fees. There's things that you do post-pandemic. There's things that you do while you're in government service because you know when you leave government service, you're going to be walking into some pretty lucrative positions.
Well,
right?
and if you're always advocating, so you may not be directly receiving money for something, but if it's like money's so fungible, right? If you're advocating for like all of these different labs that you actually have a piece of to get government funding, and you actually, are
and to be honest, I don't know what his stock portfolio looks like.
Well, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just saying there are a lot of people who believe so much in what they are doing that they would not jeopardize the funding for that. So it's not necessarily coming into his household, right?
Yeah.
But it's going into the areas he wants it in.
Yeah.
That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, let's go to this next clip.
Is the hypothesis that COVID-19 accidentally leaked from a lab a conspiracy theory?
No, I mentioned that several times. Conceptually, the concept of it is not a conspiracy theory.
Did U.S. tax dollars flow through a grant recipient to the lab in China?
I'm sorry, what was?
Did U.S. tax dollars flow through a grant recipient to the lab in China?
Yes, of course. It was a sub-award to the Wuhan Institute.
And who approved that award?
Excuse me?
And who approved that award? What agency approved that award?
National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases.
Your agency approved that, right?
Yes, it did after.
Did that have anything to do with this downplaying of the lab leak theory?
No.
Nothing to do with it?
Nothing.
What? Do you agree that there was a push to downplay the lab leak theory?
Not on my part.
Pause.
Really?
Yeah. Because we saw that before. Now you saw the forward context of this, right? And it's this idea that, okay, we now have another piece of the puzzle. The question initially was, all right, we've got a COVID virus on the loose, circling the globe, killing people. It originated in Wuhan, where there happens to be a lab that, does various functions with COVID.
That his agency sent money
right?
to.
And then you find out that, your agency approved a sub-award, a subcontract award for money for a institution that was doing work over in Wuhan. And now we're being told that, there was no, first of all, there is no gain of function, which again, he might be able to argue something on technical lines, but we all know that this effectively was gain of function research. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, you're paying for it. Because Rand Paul brought this up and Fauci was like, absolutely not. Well, yeah, of course we gave it to this company that was doing this, but it wasn't for gain of function. And so now we start to see all these things lining up where, again, a logical person looks at this, right? If you have a scientific mind and you're trying to build a good case, you're like, okay, there's now multiple reasons why Dr. Fauci could have an incentive to downplay the theory of the lab leak. And now he's coming back telling us that he didn't do that. So you got contracts approved by his agency, funding research in the lab where this broke up, funding research, which looks very similar to gain of function. Okay. You don't see any incentive structure that you could potentially have to downplay the whole idea that this was a lab leak, because if this gets back, that his agency under his watch funded the research that created essentially a super virus that ended up killing millions of people across the globe, I would say there's possibly some damages involved with respect to that. And again, maybe it has nothing to do with anything that we just saw. Nothing. But are you going to tell me that it's unreasonable or unscientific or illogical to look at all those things and say, wait a second. you might have some perverse incentives to not be completely honest about what you did or why you did it. And again, that's the part that's frustrating, is the moment you point that out, it's like, oh, this is just conspiracy theories by Republicans. He just said, well, no, I never said it was a conspiracy theory. No, we have him quoted as saying it was a conspiracy theory. He said it was a conspiracy theory. Well, not the inherent concept of a lab leak. Shut up, dude. You called it what it was. You use government power. You encourage government power to restrict people and destroy people's lives if they said it. Own up to it.
Yeah, it's like, okay, we established motive and means. In a criminal case, that would be considered good evidence.
And you certainly had opportunity. So you had method, means, and opportunity. All right, so let's go to this last clip here. This is the one that, again, I want people to really pay attention to.
We have one more that you skipped earlier.
Well, it's the same clip, basically, just a different Twitter page. So let's just
the same. They're both the same?
Yeah, essentially the same, yeah.
You said in an interview that you gave as part of an audiobook written by Michael Spector that you believed an institutional should make it hard for people to live their lives so they'd feel pressured to get vaccinated. Could we run the audio clip on that, please?
You think can be done about it? I have to say that I don't see a big solution other than some sort of mandatory vaccination. I know federal officials don't like to use that term. Once people feel empowered and protected legally, you are going to have schools, universities, and colleges are going to say, you want to come to this college, buddy? You're going to get vaccinated. Lady, you're going to get vaccinated. Yeah. Big corporations like Amazon and Facebook and all of those others are going to say, you want to work for us, you get vaccinated. And it's been proven that when you make it difficult for people in their lives, they lose their ideological bullshit and they get vaccinated.
Pause. Well.
I did not see. I've never seen that.
I hadn't either. That's if
you know what he just explained right there, inadvertently.
Yeah,
he just explained the whole concept of the cathedral or the Leviathan, the intersection of culturally shaping private institutions colluding with the state in order to take away your freedom.
Because the moment when they feel safe with the legal protections, what does that mean? It means the state, the government, is now intervening and telling a company, if you do X, you will not face any blowback or prosecution. And in fact, they did it even more because, again, Attorney General Jason Miyares was actually in here talking about this, and we're going to have that interview where they sued the federal government because the federal government went so far as under OSHA to tell companies, like if you had a certain number of employees, they had to be vaccinated or they would lose their jobs. So now not only have you told a company, if you require this, there'll be no retribution from the government. Now you've told companies you must do it. So they get to go back to their employees and say, hey, we're just following the rules. And what did Fauci say? Well, they dropped their ideological bullshit. No, what they do is they have to drop what they believe in favor of what you believe, Dr. Fauci. No, they didn't drop their ideological. They had it exchanged for them by a guy in power that thinks he knows better than everybody else. Again, don't call me a fascist when you're holding up this guy as a national hero. What a load of crap. If you want to talk about this sort of like this God mentality, that I have the special knowledge, I have the special anointing by virtue of my position and moral superiority to the general public, that I will pull the strings of government and everything else within my power in order to create conditions where you either give up your sacred beliefs or you are punished for it. And it won't just be the government prosecuting you. It will be every institution which has anything meaningful to your life shutting their doors to you. Why? Because we decided it was for your own good.
I mean, just listening to that clip kind of makes my blood boil. And the problem that we on the right have had for so long is this mentality that, well, if a private company or institution, if it's not the government that's doing it, then we have no ground to stand on to criticize it. But Fauci kind of laid out in that clip, actually, how you can have private institutions colluding with the government. again, in order to take away your freedoms or your rights, or just impose their will on you in some way or manner. And we have more than enough evidence of this happening. A really good example of this is the Twitter files. Before Elon purchased Twitter, Twitter was openly, many cases privately, but in some cases openly colluding with the federal government, certainly the FBI, in order to censor. They censored the Hunter Biden laptop. They censored other scientists that criticized Fauci's measures. If you signed the Great Barrington Declaration, we saw evidence of this. Your Twitter account was throttled at that point. Your tweets weren't shown to people when hot button topics related to those particular topics started going trending. The response from the right for so long has been, well, as long as it's just private, institutions or corporations that are doing this, we're totally fine with it. And now we're starting to realize that no. Your ideological enemies have actually captured many of these institutions, and now they've weaponized against you. And if your response is, well, we can't do anything about it, then guess what? The side that wants to win will always defeat the side that just wants to be left alone. And
well, I don't want to go too far on this, where we say that the problem, once again, though, the fundamental problem was not a company doing what it wanted. The fundamental problem was a company either using the government to give themselves legal coverage to do something that they otherwise would have been punished for in the marketplace, or looking for the government to essentially subsidize them to do something. I mean, there's no question that businesses often collude and try to work with the government to do something. I don't want to go to the other side, where now we have the other side of government saying, oh, you can't do X, Y, and Z. The fundamental problem here remains the same. It's the company going to the government to get special privileges, funding, or whatever it is in order to achieve their end states, because they don't want to face the public backlash if they just did it unilaterally.
It's not just that, though. The government was also implementing punishments to businesses that did not comply. So even the businesses were being,
in a lot
coerced.
of cases, businesses didn't want to do some of these things, and the government stepped in and said, no, you will be made to.
Or we will shut you down.
And so
I'm not attacking businesses. The point that I'm trying
Nobody
to get
thought you were attacking businesses. It's okay.
Fair, but some of our audience might be. The point that I'm trying to get across here is that it is not sufficient to simply say, I've said this before and I will say it again, there is no such thing as a neutral institution.
Yeah.
Institutions that are not directly government, but in many cases are very closely tied to the government, like the university system is a very good example of this. I would also argue the media in large respects is an example of this. These institutions are not morally neutral. They have picked a side, and they've picked a side against us.
Yeah.
And Fauci has laid out in that clip, which I'd never seen before, but it's quite eye-opening once you listen to it for the first time. He laid out a mechanism through which these institutions will use the cover provided to them by the government, so I agree with you on that point, in order to make your life miserable, basically, in order to impose their will upon you. And, we did that live stream the day after Trump's conviction. And we talked about how it's not enough to just simply say, wow, imagine if the roles were reversed.
Yeah.
In some cases, it's time to start reversing them. If you want to avoid a full-scale descent into just anarchy and tyranny, and we speed run the late Roman Republic here, if you want to avoid that, the only mechanism that you have at this point in order to prevent that outcome is they have to feel the pain. The left cannot get away with eviscerating social and political and legal norms with no consequences, because otherwise it's almost like you're touching the stove, but you're not feeling the pain.
No,
you want to talk about a really good place to start? A really good place to start for the right, and when it comes to punching back at the left, when it comes to their lawfare, is this guy.
Oh, yeah.
Is Anthony Fauci.
No,
he needs to be hauled in front of a court and made to answer for everything he did. He made our lives miserable for years. Weaponized science itself against the general public, lied to Congress, lied to the public, told corporations, the media, and universities, I got your back. You can also do the same thing because we're the government and we're going to defend you as you make their lives miserable as well. And now he's being caught red-handed for everything he did. And guess what? No repercussions whatsoever except for some Instagram reels that are smearing him. Yeah. Rightfully so, but that's the repercussions he faces? He gets some nasty Instagram reels? No, the repercussions that he needs to face are legal consequences. And until we get to that point, we should not be surprised when it's our side, when it's Republicans that are being hauled in front of a court and convicted for bogus BS charges, and nothing ever happens to anybody on the left. Those days need to be over, and they need to be over yesterday.
No, I don't disagree with any of that. I think Fauci needs to face legal consequences for and again, some of it is, I don't think someone should necessarily have to face legal consequences because they made a decision in the spur of the moment and maybe it went wrong or right, based off of imperfect information. That's not what we're talking about, because there's a lot of Democrats trying to caricature what we're talking about here as, it was a difficult situation. Do you want to convict every single soldier that made a decision? And it's like, well, you guys do. You guys want to convict every cop. You guys want to convict every soldier. You want to convict everybody that working in an emergency situation, right? But you don't want to hold this guy accountable for things that were being done where I think he lied to Congress. I think he certainly lied to the American public. I think there was also things that he probably did where he was covering up information, or they were using the government in inappropriate ways in order to shut down dissent. I think people should be poring. I think the appropriate attorneys should be poring over, how do we prosecute him for these things, right? If you can prosecute Donald Trump for supposed hush money from 8 years ago, if you can do that, well then explain to me. Or 8 years after the fact, explain to me how you cannot go through and look at this and say, wait a second, information disappeared, people were threatened, people were intimidated, stuff was covered up, you lied before Congress. You're not even going to try to indict him on any of that? Not even going to try. Is that what we're being told? Like, that's the part that people are absolutely fed up with. But I will say this, the biggest thing that the other side will completely screw up on this if they don't get it right is understanding that it's not just Fauci. It's the very bureaucracy and the perverse incentives you have set up within these institutions. It's the level of power that you have given them over your daily lives. And if you do not have a chief executive that is willing to go after the bureaucracy the way they need to be gone after, you're just going to get a different guy doing the same thing in 20 years, right? If you don't have somebody that's actually willing to address how the money is spent in this country, because another thing that you see with this is that Democrats do an excellent job of funding their allies and punishing their enemies. Now, I'm never going to sit here and say, you know what Republicans need to do? We need to start just throwing tax dollars at, the NRA or the NAGR, or GOA or whatever it is. I'm not going to do that because I don't think it's an appropriate expenditure of tax dollars. But my gosh, every time we look, we're dealing with a situation right now in Virginia where higher ed currently has to, they currently have to fund a program that is designed to service disabled veterans and their families, right? And higher ed's coming back like, we just don't got the money. We just don't got the money to do it. We're gonna have to put restrictions on it. And we're actually going into special session to consider it. Now, I know this seems off topic. Let me tell you why it's on topic. Because the argument I have going back is, wait a second, we give you billions of tax dollars. You always have money for your ideological projects, but you don't have enough money, which is a drop in the bucket compared to everything else you're doing. You don't have enough money for this. And the reason why I bring that point up is because it's such a stark contrast. It just demonstrates that over and over and over again, if they are using your tax dollars to fund organizations, institutions, and bureaucracies in order to further their ideological agenda, they think that is perfectly normal, perfectly on the up and up. They would cry bloody murder if the right tried to do anything remotely similar to it. And the point of all of this is, yes, Fauci needs to be prosecuted. If our side doesn't have a team of lawyers looking at all the ways that we can potentially run him in front of a court, then we are failing miserably. But do not get so caught up on one man that we forget that there was an entire institution, there was an entire government system that was built around making what he did possible.
Yep.
And if you are not going after that too, you are missing the point.
The enemy is not just Anthony Fauci any more than it's Joe Biden.
Yeah.
We've talked about this at length. It's the bureaucracy. It's the managerial class. They are the ones that are authorizing all of this, that are enabling all of this to happen in the first place. And that's not to say that Fauci's just a front man, right?
No.
But what we mean by this is that, yes, it's a good first step. I know that we love using that phrase, right? It's a good first step to haul Fauci in front of a court, but it can't end there. You can't simply say, well, we're going to follow Elon Musk's recommendations where he tweets, my pronouns are prosecute/Fauci. It's not enough to do that. It's a necessary but not sufficient thing to prosecute somebody like Anthony Fauci. What really needs to be done is we need to clean house within the bureaucracy.
Yes.
And we need to drastically reduce. We need to do to the bureaucracy what Elon did to Twitter, or what Malay is currently doing to the bureaucracy in Argentina. And you know what? They'll call us names, right? They called Malay names, but there's nothing authoritarian, there's nothing dystopian, there's nothing fascist, there's nothing diabolical about demolishing government power and eradicating the bureaucracy. Returning power back to the people in the form of more freedom and less bureaucracy is not fascism. That's the exact opposite of fascism.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't be worried about what sort of names or labels the left throws at us once we actually take the type of sledgehammer that we need to take to the bureaucracy. I know that there's this final clip that I think you wanted to play between Rand Paul and Fauci. Do you want to go through that?
We can do that real quick, and then we're going to close out.
So I ask myself, why would Senator want to do this? So go to Rand Paul website, and you see Fire Dr. Fauci with a little box that says, contribute here. You can do $5, $10, $20, $100. So you are making a catastrophic epidemic for your political gain. So the
you have politically attacked your colleagues and in a politically reprehensible way attacked their reputations.
Okay,
you won't defend it.
No,
you won't
well,
argue it.
I'm
You'll just
sorry,
simply
we're
turn around
going
the
to
attack.
continue this hearing. We have a number of
That was Fauci trying to call out Rand Paul because he's got a fundraising site for his campaign, and he's actually made going after Fauci one of the key things that he's trying to do, which, you know what? Good.
Yeah.
Good.
If you
But-
want to get rid of Fauci, get him reelected.
You have
That's
to elect
wrong.
you have to elect the sort of people that will actually hold him to account. And Rand Paul has probably been the best in Congress at actually holding Fauci to the fire. But again, the point is that, oh, okay, so if you donate $50 to Rand Paul because he's going after Fauci, that's evidence of just corruption and the whole deal. But if $710 billion goes in royalties to NIH scientists, and if NIH is going around and actually like pushing the government to silence anybody that disagrees with them on anything, no corruption there. That's just the way we do things. We represent science. No, look, I'm gonna wrap it up with this. At the beginning of this, we try to do a steel man argument for Fauci. We try to lay the groundwork on like what are the different conditions where you can understand why Fauci made certain decisions or why he would have done certain things. But when I looked at this testimony, the thing that just infuriated me more than anything else was that audio clip. That is Fauci talking about how he wants to work with the government to provide legal protections in order to get his end state that he wants. And how does he do it? And this is the way he said it again. He goes, when you create conditions where essentially you can't get into the school you want to go to, where you can't run your business, when you can't get access to the goods and services you need, then you will drop your ideological BS. Yeah, in exchange for his ideological BS, because that's what that was. That is somebody drunk on power, using the power of government to compel you through force and coercion to do what they want. And the big question at the end of the day was, wow, did that really save? Did that really save everyone? Was that on the whole better than what could have happened if we would have actually allowed dissenting voices? I'm not talking about anybody screaming on Twitter. I'm talking about reputable scientists in this field that came forward and said, we've got problems with what is going on. We got problems with the sort of trade-offs that are being considered. We got problem with the suppression of some certain information. We got problems with the idea that you're going to destroy the professional and public lives of people that dare to stand up and say that there might be another way to consider what's going on. And Dr. Fauci stood up there and bragged about utilizing the power of government to essentially shut down his enemies. And then when he was asked about it, act as if, oh, nothing I did. I kept an open mind. I agree with Christian on this one. I am not what you call sue happy. A lot of times I will look at the sort of things that people want to sue politicians over, and I look at them going, do you understand how the law works? Politicians are allowed to do the things that you want to put them in jail for. They're allowed to do it. And maybe we should have thought about that before we gave the government the extent of the power that we have given government. Maybe we should have thought about that before some of these people got elected, got into power, and used their power in legitimate ways to do horrible things. But I don't think this guy has used his power legitimately. I do think that there's ways that we need to go after him legally. But if we miss the larger point here, which is this is the sort of perverse incentives created within massive federal bureaucracies, massive government bureaucracies, period. And that any time that they get this sense of moral righteousness where now they not only get to tell you what they think you should do, but they get to shut down anybody that disagrees with them. And those are the same people coming back and calling you a fascist. That's the part where it's time to wake up and recognize that the way we're going to dig ourselves out of this hole politically is not just through lawsuits, although that is a huge portion of it and something we need to get a whole lot better at because it's currently being used against us. But we need the sort of politicians that when they run, they promise you they're going to address the bureaucracy. I am telling you right now, I don't care what letter they have by their name on the ballot box. If they're not telling you the steps that they're going to take to defund massive elements of the bureaucracy and to once again take power back into the hands of the legislature as opposed to delegating it to executive branch agencies, if they're not telling you how they're going to do that and they're not serious about it, they're not worthy of your vote at this point, especially at the federal level, especially. And those are the sort of questions that you need to ask anybody that seeks to represent you at those levels. Once again, I hope you found our analysis interesting and intriguing. I hope we brought up some of the points that you needed to know for when these conversations come up and wondering, what all happened, when, who said what. Hope we did a fairly good job within a brief period of time of highlighting all that for you. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next episode.